Hello everyone. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for our webinar on alarm management, international standards and compliance. Max Solutions are the creators of the ProcessView Alarm Management Suite, which according to a recent ARC study is the most popular independent alarm management software used in the European power generation market. We offer software, services and training in all aspects of alarm management, and we're based in the UK. My name is James Fox. Having worked for IMAC, Matricon and Honeywell in the alarm management arena over the last 20 years, holding roles in technical support, site engineering, training and sales, I'm now the product manager for the ProcessView suite. Joining me on this webinar is Ian Brown. Ian Brown is our alarm rationalization and services manager with over 40 years experience in the process industries. Ian has held a variety of technical, maintenance management and consultancy roles, specifically focusing on alarm management for the past 14 years. Ian's expertise covers IEC 62682, ISA 18.2 and EMEA 191. He's also trained as a TUV certified functional safety engineer. With that, I'd now like to hand you over to Ian, who will take us through the presentation. If you have any questions, you can key them into the interface on your screen or wait till the end where we will have a short Q&A session. Okay, over to you, Ian.
Okay, thanks for that, James. Thanks for the introductions. Welcome to the webinar today, wherever you are in the world. Good morning in the UK. Today's webinar is going to be about alarm management and international standards and compliance, and whether we comply or should comply, shouldn't comply. Specifically, the alarm management standards I'm talking about today are ISA 18.2 2016, the second edition, and IEC 62682, which was the IEC version, an updated version of the ISA standard. So it's the alarm management standards that I will be talking about today and compliance to those. There are, of course, other variants of the IEC standard. For example, BSEN 62682 in the UK is the British standard, and in Australia there's an Australian standard, ASIEC 62682, which was clearly published in 2017. It's just a direct copy, as the British standard is, of IEC 62682. I think the British standard has 3 pages missing, which are all the international bits referring to international stuff. So they've taken that out. So you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, page 11, something like that anyway. So it's the standards I'm going to be talking about today. Do we really need to comply with them? Everybody tells you when you're looking at benchmarks and things, do you comply with the standards? Do you comply with this, that, and the other? Do we actually have to? That's the question you might be asking. And especially at the moment, how does compliance affect our businesses? So that's the gist of this webinar today. Okay. Let's assume we have some kind of process facility. Everything at the beginning of the year was going swimmingly. Everything was fine. And then along came a rather nasty virus. Well, lots of process facilities are still open. We can't shut down power stations because we'll have nowhere to generate power to make our tea, for example. We can't shut down pharmaceutical plants because there'll be no pills and potions to cure us from our ailments. So lots of process facilities, like other businesses, are remaining open, but we've had to manage and mitigate the way we work together. So we've had to do a different way of working. So obviously for process facilities, we have operators. They sit in the plant. Generally, they can't work from home, usually. They sit in the plant and operate the plant. To help them operate the plant, we obviously have some essential people, which are part of the plant, part of your business, such as maintenance people. If the plant stops working, you have to have someone there to put it right for the operators to be able to operate. The rest of us, many of us are working from home, such as process engineers, managers. Lots of people are working from home. Unfortunately, some people were furloughed. So we've got a different way of working at the moment, fewer and fewer people on site. So what does this actually mean for our businesses, this new way of working at the moment? Well, effectively, most businesses are only tackling essential work. So things like projects are being put back, or we'll put that back when things, quote, return to normal. So what are the things that we can realistically stop doing? Project work, for one example. You can't stop doing essential maintenance work because your plant won't work. We'll have no cups of tea, for example. So what about alarm management and rationalization? Well, there's no reason why you have to stop managing your alarms. No reason why you have to stop rationalizing your alarms. You could conduct meetings across Microsoft Teams, Skype, whatever your chosen video platform is. There's no reason why you have to stop doing that. So what can we realistically stop? You could, if you want to, stop that. What about standards compliance? And that's what we're talking about today. So rationalization, you could do it. It's up to you. It may be a choice. It may not be a choice. But complying with the standards, do we have to carry on? And what do we actually mean about complying with standards? What do we mean by compliance? Well, if we look in the dictionary, compliance is defined as the act of obeying an order, a rule, or request. For example, the law. Okay, that's fairly straightforward. So it's the act of obeying an order. So around the world, what does compliance mean? Can we comply easily around the world? Well, at the last count, there are 193 countries in the world that are part of the United Nations. 195 if you include 2 observer countries. But individual countries, there are around about 249. Obviously, around about 50 aren't part of the UN. So there are about 250 countries in the world. Do they all have the same laws and legislative processes? Remember, compliance is about obeying rules. So do we have the same laws around the world? Well, no, we don't. We've got 250 countries. They don't all have the same laws. Or do they? Excuse me. Well, there are international laws that apply to all the countries in the world. Well, 193 or 195 of the 249, so not all of them. And these are brought about, they come into law through conventions and treaties, through standards, what we're talking about today, standards. There are laws of the sea. So throughout the international law that applies to the United Nations countries. Each individual country, all 249 of them, will have their own country laws. Some of those country laws will be the same as other countries because they're developed through treaties with other countries. So 2 countries may have a similar law. Each country may have, for example, in America, in North America, you have 50 states. Each individual state, apart from laws which apply to the whole country, North America, will apply only to one particular state, for example. In Australia, there are two territories and 6 states. Each of those individual areas can have their own laws. Individual areas, regions, cities within a country can have their own laws that are different to the laws of the country, different to international laws. And certainly in the UK and I throughout the world, small parts of cities or towns may have their own local laws. And in the UK, these are called bylaws. There may be a different name in the country you come from. So there are a whole bunch of stuff. But effectively, lots of countries have their own laws. Unless you consider the European Union, of course, which is a union of 27 countries now. They have laws, individual country laws, which I'll show in a second again, but they also have EU directives which apply to each of the countries within the EU. So if a directive is generated within Brussels, then that must be enacted in law by each of the member states. So you have a common law covering each of the 27 countries in the EU, and then each of those individual member states, they're called member states, have their own country laws, area, region, city. So altogether, compliance is really easy, isn't it? Knowing what you have to comply with, it's pretty easy, isn't it? Maybe not. Okay, so what do we have to comply with? On the earlier slide, I said an act, a rule, you have to comply with rules, you have to obey rules. So what can we comply with? The law, we must. So that's we have to, unfortunately, or we go to jail, potentially. What about standards? Do we have to comply with standards? This is what this webinar is about today. Do we really have to comply with standards? This is what I'm going to talk about. What we can't comply with are guidelines. Guidelines are not rules, they're suggestions of how to do things. So for example, the guidelines in EMEA 191, everyone accepted that as a de facto standard. It existed, the guidelines existed. People said, well, it's really a standard, but it wasn't a standard. It didn't tell you what to do, it simply suggested methods of achieving things. So they're not legal, they're not accepted as a standard or a law, they're just ways of doing things. ISA 18.2, one of the alarm management standards, has a number of associated technical reports, TRs. They as well are guidelines, they are how-to guides on how to comply with the standard. That's assuming we have to comply with the standard, which we don't know yet because you haven't heard the rest of the webinar. There are things in the UK, and I'm sure there will be around the world similar to the UK, things called Approved Codes of Practice, or ACOPs. These are guidelines, again, just guidelines, but they are there to help you comply with the law. So if you have to comply with a law, it tells you how you could do it. So ACOPs are slightly different to general guidelines. They tell you how to comply with the law. If you follow the advice of ACOPs and their guidelines, you'll be doing enough to comply with the law, so you should be okay. You can use alternative methods, but ACOPs have special legal status. If you don't follow the advice and you're prosecuted for a breach of health and safety law, the court is likely to find you at fault unless you've complied by another method, and you have to be really strict in showing how you've complied with the law, and it's more difficult because the ACOPs are there to tell you this is what we recommend. I actually had an issue with ACOPs when I was a maintenance manager, just to give you an indication, with regard to Legionella. Legionnaire's disease. We detected Legionella on our plant, and when the HSE guy came along, there was an ACOP L8, I think it was, that suggested you used one kind of biocide, one method of introducing biocide to kill the Legionella in your cooling towers. Our water company used the alternative method, and when the HSE inspector was there, he said, you don't use the same method we recommend in the ACOP. I said, well, we use the other method, it's acceptable. Yes, but we recommend in the ACOP, this is what you use. If you go to court and you're found guilty of killing someone because you've had Legionella from your cooling tower and someone's died, you'll have to explain why you didn't use this method, because clearly yours is not as effective as ours, although it is acceptable. I ended up changing our water treatment, but effectively the ACOPs tell you, give you guidance, but they're kind of a bit more difficult with law. So standards, this is where we're looking at today. What are they? Okay, a standard is a document that's approved by a number of people or groups of people, companies, whatever, generally by a recognized standardization body like the ISA, IEC, etc., etc. It provides common rules, definitions, and guidance. Okay, so we have rules, and if we think about compliance, it's the act of obeying a rule. So there are a set of rules in there. Okay, we also have definitions in there, and the definitions are to define exactly what we mean by things. So if I talk about an alarm, then someone in Malaysia will understand what I mean by an alarm. It gives us a common language definitions when we're talking to each other. And standards provide guidance as well. So they have rules and definitions and guidance. And of course, within standards, if you have to comply with a standard, shall indicates a mandatory requirement. So you have to do this if you're going to comply with the standard. But at this moment, we still don't know, do we have to comply with the standard? It's not law. Should indicates best practice. And like the Legionella thing, you should do this. If you use an alternative method, then you have to show that your alternative method delivers the same or better level of protection. It's as good as or better than what we suggest. You know better than the rest of the world, clearly, but your method is better. So just be careful if you use something instead of a should. So, as I said, standards through international bodies. You have the ISA, ISO, EN. We've got national standards. So they were international standards. National standards, for example, BS, prefixed by BS, the BS EN 62682. Australian standards, AS, EN 62682. We have standards for industrial sectors. So there will be standards with a set of rules, guidance and definitions for agriculture, for fishing, for aeronautics, whatever. There'll be standards for all sorts of things, nuclear standards. And of course, you can have your own in-house standard. So you can develop a standard which, if you have a number of facilities around the world or a particular country, you can say, this is how we are going to do this particular thing. Here's a set of rules so everyone on each plant knows exactly what we have to do. So you can create your own in-house standards. Now, standards are voluntary. You do not have to comply with a standard. They have no legal standing. No legal responsibilities are imposed through complying with it. There's nothing in law that says you must follow a standard. So standards, if you don't comply with a standard, why waste the time? Why waste the money and the effort? You don't have to. They are voluntary. Unless a piece of legislation which is specific to your country actually refers to a standard by name. So if it refers to an alarm management standard in accordance with IEC 62682, then that standard then has a legal force and you have to comply with the standard. If a piece of legislation, which you have to obey and comply with, simply refers to alarm management, it's up to you what you do, whether you comply with the standard or not. So when you're conforming with a standard, when you comply with a standard, I've mentioned there are guidance in standards. In IEC 62682 and 18.2, although you don't specifically generally have to comply with a standard, if you wish to, then, as you can see on the bottom paragraph, it shall be shown that each of the required in the normative clauses has been satisfied. So that's the responsibility of the owner operator, the people operating the plant, the not operators as in keyboard operators, but the owner of the plant. So you have to comply, you have to show that you've done everything where it says you shall do this. If you're going to comply with the standard, you have to comply with everything that says you shall. You can't just do half of the shalls and that's enough. You haven't fully complied with the standard. So standards are voluntary. You do not have to follow them unless there's a specific reference to them within a piece of legislation. So if it's specifically referenced within legislation, or of course, if you are subject to regulatory intervention. So if you've had a visit from an environment agency, the HSE in the UK, Health and Safety Executive, for example, and you've received an improvement notice, then you may have a reference within that improvement notice that says in accordance with, at which case you have to follow them. So with reference to a high hazard plant, that I did an alarm management benchmark assessment on a few years ago. This is a section from a letter from the HSE. I'm clearly not going to identify the plant. There are a number of recommendations. The HSE wrote. Number of recommendations are included in the inspection report. The first thing to note, please reply by 25th of September 2015, outlining your response. The letter was sent on the 26th of August 2015, so they had a month to reply to, these are the things that we tell you you have to do. Okay, there was also a section in the letter that said about information for employees. So there were some things that the company in particular had to do, but according to this, inspectors have to provide information about health and safety matters to employee. Accordingly, as it says in the paragraph, I enclose a copy of this letter for you to share with them. So not only did the company have to deal with the issues raised by the HSE, but they had to tell their employees what the issues were and what they were going to do about it. And in your written response, please outline how you've met this requirement. So you have to tell the regulator you've informed your employees, and this is how. So not only do you have to do the work, but you have to communicate that as well. And this the plant was a high hazard plant, which is governed under the Control of Major Accident Hazard Regulations 2015, which is the COMA regs in the UK. Under Regulation 5, one of the improvements they had to do, Action Legal 2, so this was, you have to do this, alarm management philosophy, by the 12th of February 2016. So they're given about 5 months to create an alarm management philosophy. And the second line underneath Action Legal there says the operator, i.e. the person who owns the plant and runs a plant, should review relevant standards and guidance on alarm management and develop an establishment-specific alarm management philosophy. So they are now referring to the alarm management standards. So now you have to comply with the standards. You have to do what the standards say with reference to creating an alarm philosophy. It's no longer simply create one. It says refer to the standards. So now the standards are coming into play. So in this case, the company had to comply with the standards. So in complying with the standards, do we have to comply with absolutely everything? Well, the previous an earlier slide mentioned you have to show that you've complied with all the normative sections. Okay, are all the sections in a standard normative, i.e. you must do them? Not necessarily. In the alarm management standards, clause 12 or section 12 is informative. There's actually a note in the original edition of ISA 18.2, which was published in 2009, the highlighted section in red there, statement in red, note this clause is informative, does not contain any mandatory requirements. So whatever was in section 12, you don't have to comply with that. You don't have to do it. The section in the highlighted text provides guidance and consideration. And that's because this section was about enhanced alarm methods, which a lot of enhanced and advanced alarm methods don't exist in legacy systems. So it's no good creating a rule, which is what standards are about, that says you shall apply this methodology, because a lot of systems don't have the functionality to apply it. So it's no good having a rule that says you must, because you're not complying with the standard. Well, I can't. So that's why section 12 is simply informative. So not everything in a standard has to be complied with. You have to read the standard and say, do I have to do this clause? Yes. Do I have to do this clause? No, that's only for information. Okay, don't have to do that bit. Do I have to do this bit? Yes. So you need to know your standards. And of course, interestingly, in the 2014 version of IEC 62682, which was published then, and the 2016 edition, the second edition of ISA 18.2, that highlighted text where I have a red box around, that note has disappeared. However, the clause has not changed. It is still informative. If you read the highlighted text there, clause 12 provides guidance and consideration. So it's still not a normative clause that you have to do. So just be careful when you're going through the standards. Sometimes it will tell you this is just for information. Don't need to do it. Sometimes it won't. You need to read the standards very carefully if you are going to comply with one, to comply with it, with everything. So in the alarm management standards, there are 19 sections which are highlighted on the screen. Obviously, we don't have to do everything. Section 4, for example, conformance to the standard. That was a note that tells you what you have to do to comply to the standard. Section 12, for example, detailed design, advanced alarm methods. That was informative. So not all of these sections, you don't have to do everything in there. For example, monitoring and assessment is a mandatory clause. You need to do that if you're going to comply with the standards. And of course, referring back to the letter, extracts of which I showed you a couple of slides ago, referencing alarm philosophy, you have to do section 6. You must have something about your alarm philosophy if you're going to comply with the standards. But even then, it's not straightforward. If we look at section 6 in the standards, and this is the table, the latest table taken from ISA 18.2, the second edition, 2016, published in 2016, I've highlighted 2 sections there. You have to comply with the standard because the letter that the company was given says you have to follow the standards to create an alarm philosophy. Okay, if we look at the top section there, the first highlighted section in yellow, I'm going to highlight it now, purpose of an alarm system. So clause 6.2.2 within the standards, both ISA 18.2 and IEC 62682, so section 6.2.2, it says in the first sentence of that thing, it says the alarm philosophy shall include the purpose and objectives of the alarm system. So you have to include a definition of what your alarm system is there for in your alarm philosophy. If you look at the table, I don't know if you can see easily the first highlighted line, required and recommended, it says this section is required. The second highlighted section, references, it says recommended. So if we look at clause 6.2.4, which is in the right-hand column of the table, references, the first sentence says the alarm philosophy should include a list of appropriate references. It should do, but if you don't, you're not failing to comply with the standard. So even though section 6, you have to comply with section 6, you only have to comply with parts of section 6. So it gets fun, doesn't it? So within section 6, for example, these are the sections that you must have within your alarm philosophy. So when that company had to develop an alarm philosophy, they had the beginnings of one, and I did a review and a gap analysis and told them where they were missing, what they had to put in. They had to have, for example, the purpose of the alarm system. That's required. A prioritization method, for example. It's no good just leaving prioritization to guesswork. You have to have a section that tells you how you're going to prioritize your alarms, how you're going to rationalize them, how you're going to do training, how you're going to test your alarms, how you're going to audit your system. All these sections are required in an alarm philosophy if you are going to comply with the standard. The sections which are recommended, i.e. you should, it'd be good if you did, references, which we just referred to. We've got approved, enhanced and advanced alarming techniques. That's section 12. It's information only. If you can do it, it's great. If you don't, you can still comply with the standard. So complying with standards is not simple. Do you have to? No, but maybe if the law says you have to, or you've got a regulatory intervention that says you've got to comply with the standards or follow the standards. In that case, yes. So, but other than that, they're voluntary. So do you comply? Maybe, perhaps, maybe you have to. So why would you comply or attempt to comply with the standards? Because going through a standard, it's not just do everything that's written there. You have to decide, oh, I don't need to do that part. I need to do that part, as I've just highlighted on the previous pages. Alarm management itself is a significant investment in time and money. So why would you want to comply with a standard if you don't have to? Well, you may have regulatory pressures, such as the letter I showed excerpts from in the previous slides. You may have received an improvement notice. So you may have no choice but to comply with the standard. In that case, time and money don't really matter because you have to. Or you may have corporate pressures. So it may be a requirement from head office that we have decided we are a responsible company. We want to manage our alarms appropriately. We want to comply with the standards to improve alarm management. They may be doing process safety management exercise and say, as part of that, we want to improve our alarms. Perhaps insurance companies, in some cases, companies will say, we won't insure you unless you comply with whatever. So a number of reasons why you may wish to comply or have to comply. So standards and legislation, where does that leave us? In principle, unless a standard is referred to within a piece of legislation, then you don't have to comply with it. So in the EU, there was a Seveso directive. Seveso was a small town in the north of Italy where there was an explosion at a high hazard plant. Seveso directive came out dealing with hazardous materials. In 2012, it went from Seveso 2 directive to Seveso 3. As part of that, in the text of the directive, which had to be enacted in law by each of the 28 at the time member states, Great Britain is no longer part of the EU, we've withdrawn, there were some words, and for alarm management, added into one of the annexes. Now, those words were just added in. If we look at the COMA regulations, which were published in 2015, these are the enactment in law in the UK of the Seveso directive from the EU when we were still members. Again, the COMA regulations have the same paragraph there. Following matters must be addressed by the safety management system. So there must be. COMA 2015 is law. It's saying you must do this. So you have to do this. And the words "and for alarm management" have been added in. So they say you have to carry out some way of managing you have to manage your alarms. Now, as with Seveso, there are no direct references to an alarm management standard. It doesn't say you must comply with ISA 18.2, for example. So it tells you you have to manage your alarms, but it doesn't tell you what you have to do. So although the requirement to manage alarms is mandatory, it's the law, you have to manage them, it leaves it to you how you're going to approach it. So if we look in the USA, for example, in America, there are things called codes of federal regulations, laws. There are a whole bunch of sections. There are 50 different subject matter titles. Number 1, subject matter number 1 is general provisions. Number 3 references the president. 21 and 29 are food and drugs for Food and Drugs Administration. 29 is a section for labor, the Occupational Safety Health Administration, Occupational and Safety Health Administration. Why have I highlighted 29? Well, because there are references to how you manage your plant, looking after your people. And of course, section 49, transportation. What has transportation got to do with alarms? Well, if we look at Section 49, a Code of Federal Regulations. If we look at 49 CFR 192.631, Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. It's regulated by the Department of Transport, DOT. In page 510 of that regulation, alarm management is mentioned. There's another regulation, 49 CFR 195.446, again, to do with pipelines. Page 615, the words alarm management appear. So you have to, by law, to comply with the legislation, which is 49 CFR and these numbers, you have to manage your alarms. So as with Seveso and the COMA regulations, alarm management is mandatory because this is in the law. It says you've got to do alarm management. But again, there's no direct reference to an actual standard. Now, as everybody knows, I'm sure, legislation and standards evolve over time. So if you have a compliance officer, a health and safety officer, HSE, or environmental officer, they need to keep up to date with the latest regulations, the latest laws and standards, ideally, because standards may be affected. So you need to make sure that you or your compliance officer knows exactly what's going on. How does it affect me in the USA? We have these 249 CFR regulations. If I pick a page out of that regulation, 195.446, I have highlighted a section of text which you probably can't read, but I'm going to show on the screen in a second. The words immediately prior to that highlighted section is for the safe operation of a pipeline facility. E, alarm management. Each operator must have a written alarm management plan. Okay, so this is effectively telling you you need to have an alarm philosophy. You've got to have something written down. It's the law to comply with this. And transport, you're transporting gas, oil, hazardous chemicals, for example, from one location in the country to another location. So that's why it's under transport. You're transporting materials from one location to another. And if you are responsible for a whole pipeline or even part of a pipeline, then these regulations apply to you. So you have to do alarm management. So like the COMA and the Seveso regulations, you have to manage your alarms, but it doesn't tell you what you have to comply with or what you have to do. It's up to you. So in the sections underneath, an operator's plan must include provisions to the first section, review SCADA safety-related alarm operations. So this is now getting specific. It's saying, how many times has your safety system activated? How many times has a demand been placed on it? You need to review this. It then goes on, you've got to do things. So you have to review the number of times there's demand placed on your safety system. Section 5 underneath, monitor the content and volume of general activity. This is referring to the alarm rate. How many alarms are your operators receiving? How many are enunciated to your operator? So it's giving you specific things that in law you have to do. You have to monitor the alarm rate. This is what that section 5 is about. So, okay, I've monitored the alarm rate. Section 6 says address deficiencies identified through the implementation of paragraphs E1 to 5. So it's no good just monitoring this. The law says if there's something wrong, if you've got a high rate, you've got to do something about it. But it still doesn't refer to a standard that you have to comply with. It still doesn't refer you or tell you what to do. It's up to you how you do it. So what if I don't comply? What if I choose to do my own thing or not comply at all? What's the cost? Well, in principle, nothing, because compliance with standards is voluntary in general, unless, of course, there's something in a piece of legislation or a regulatory intervention that says you must comply with the standard. But in general, there's no real cost to not complying with the standard. You can do your own thing, and there's nothing to stop you from doing that. However, If you don't comply with standards and don't follow the rules that lots of people have set down and talked about and come up with a general set of rules, this is how we should really do it. If you do your own thing, what you're effectively saying, I think I said it earlier, you are better than the rest of the world. You know better than everyone else. So you better be absolutely sure you know what you're talking about. So there's potential for regulatory enforcement, prosecution. Ultimately, your plant could be closed. Stop producing, stop working until you've resolved these issues. There's the potential for that if you don't comply. And of course, regulators and the judiciary are getting tougher. I've got 3 examples here. In the UK in 2017, a water company was fined £20,361,140 for environmental breaches. It wasn't all about alarms, but alarms were part of it. During the trial, there are a number of statements on the screen here about alarms going off for days on end. Priority alarm was left for 6 hours. Another alarm that should have been dealt with in 2 hours took a day and a half to respond to. Now, this company, the water company in question, they were repeat offenders. They had regularly not complied with the things that they were told to do. They didn't comply with standard. We don't need to do that. They were repeat offenders. So that is reflected in the actual level of the fine. But the judge, when he summed up, said, I have to make the fine sufficiently large that you get the message. You have to do these things that you've been told you have to do. You've got to do them, otherwise you will be fined. And it should not be cheaper to offend than to take the appropriate precautions. So if it costs you £1 million to manage your alarms appropriately in a year, if you don't do that because you don't want to spend £1 million, be aware, we're going to charge you £20 million when we catch you. So it's not going to be cheaper to do nothing. It's going to be much tougher. The company was actually given 21 days to pay, and it was made quite clear that the fine had to come out of the shareholders' dividends, and the company was going to be monitored to make sure they didn't put up water prices to make the customers pay. It had to hit the dividend, hit the shareholders' dividend in the pocket. So you know we're serious. Another one in the UK in 2017, a steel company was fined £1 million for release of a vapor cloud. Again, the judge listed 7 failings, one of which was failed alarms. So alarms were part of this issue. When he summed up, the judge said large companies must expect to pay heavy fines. You've got to expect it. If you don't do these things, be warned, you will have to pay for it. I like this statement. This is a statement from his ruling. It must be made clear beyond peradventure, beyond doubt, that health and safety obligations are exactly that, even when there's a challenging commercial climate. And what more challenging commercial climate could we have than at this very moment in time, since more or less the beginning of the year, when we're locked down, we're furloughed, we've got staff in work, working from home. It's very challenging at the moment, but that doesn't mean to say you can drop your guard. In this case, the company, I actually did some work for them in 2018. I went and helped, wrote their alarm philosophy for them, and then I went to help them with some reviews, rationalization reviews. They had actually started their central engineering function. People had started to write an alarm philosophy 8 years previously in 2010. They'd started and then it was too much effort, didn't have enough people, oh, we'll just leave it. So they actually started, it was a high hazard plant, steel mills were high hazard plants. They'd started 2015, COMA regulations came in, you must do alarm management. They failed to comply. They didn't read the wording and for alarm management. It's the law, we've got to do it now, let's do it. They just left it rolling and rolling and ended up with fines after an issue. And of course, it's not just money. In a trial in the USA in 2019, a former oil executive was sent to prison. he had to do 18 months in prison and was then 3 years of supervised release. He was fined $50,000 for his role in a 2012 explosion where 3 workers were injured. He was found guilty on 3 counts, conspiracy and 2 counts with the Clean Air Act. But basically, he had knowingly endangered an oil processing. He operated an oil facility. He had been told by plant's foreman that there are issues, there are things that are wrong here. And as CEO, he said, run the plant. We want to make money, run the plant. But this is wrong. This is not correct. Run the plant. A few years later, he's in jail. So it's not just about fines for companies. Potentially, if you knowingly ignore things and leave things, you could end up in jail. So just think about that. So employees expect employers to adhere to federal regulations. There were regulations that should have been adhered to. The executive nope, just run the plant. And in hazardous material and transport processing, this expectation is paramount. So clearly, they had breached the fact that the 49 CFR regulations that I mentioned a little earlier, where it says alarm management, they weren't doing that. That was one of the things they weren't doing. So he ended up in jail. So non-compliance could be very, very costly to you. So to conclude, stay up to date. Make sure you know exactly what the legislation is that applies to your plant, your facility. Make sure you know what standards have changed. And that may sound, yeah, that's okay. There's no problem. Our people are on the ball. They know when regulations and legislation changes. I did a benchmark, again, an assessment of a system on a pharmaceutical plant. The pharmaceutical compliance manager, or I think it was the environmental compliance manager actually, knew that the COMA regulations were coming in. The HSE compliance manager knew these regulations were coming in. Interestingly, if you go on the Seveso websites, if you go on the UK HSE's websites regarding COMA, there is no mention of the word alarm management. It tells you about different hazardous materials and major changes to the legislation, but nowhere does it mention the 4 words and for alarm management. So although the people on the pharmaceutical plant knew, oh, if we store more than this quantity of this new material, we now fall under these regulations. They knew those things, but nobody had read all the way through and spotted the words alarm management. So they weren't aware that there was actually a legislative requirement to manage their alarms. They didn't realize that until I showed a slide similar to the one I showed previously with those words highlighted. Did they know that? No. So just because you look through a piece of legislation doesn't mean to say you're going to get it right all the time, and you may fall foul of the law. And in fact, a major global company that has a consultancy arm, they produced a video over an hour long about changes to the Seveso and COMA regulations. I actually watched this 2 or 3 years ago, that video, and not once in the whole hour-long video from a global consultant did they mention the words for alarm management. They told you about hazardous materials, how things were changing, but nobody mentioned alarm management. So anyone watching that video, oh, we comply with everything. If you're not managing your alarms, you don't comply with the law. So be careful. Make sure you know exactly what's happening. It's not difficult. If you can get an electronic copy of the legislation, the regulations, you simply type the word alarm or alarm management. That's how I do it. It's easy to find the word alarm. Does it have any reference to alarm management? No. Doesn't apply? Yes, it does. Then it does apply. So make sure you stay up to date. Do we have to comply with alarm management standards? In general, no. This is what the whole thing is about. They're voluntary. standards and compliance with standards is in general voluntary, unless it's specifically referred to a particular standard by name, then that standard has a legal standing. If it simply says alarm management, as in COMA 2015, as in the Seveso regulations, as in the CFR regulations are highlighted on the screen, they simply say alarm management, managing alarms. You don't have to comply with the standard, you can do it yourself. Can we make our own rules and standards? Well, yes. You don't have to follow IEC 62682. You don't have to comply with ISA 18.2. You can make your own standard that says this is how we shall manage alarms on our plants. Just make sure that when you do that, if you do that and you don't follow the internationally recognized standards, that you do something that is as good or better than what those internationally recognized standards do. Because if you fall foul of the law, I think you're going to end up in serious trouble. Why did you not comply with the standards? That's recognized the standard way of doing things. You've done it differently. You haven't met any of these issues. You haven't resolved anything. So should we comply with the standards? That's the question. In my opinion, yes, because those standards have been put together by groups of people, groups of organizations. They've been recognized generally through a standards body that puts a number in front of it, ISA 18.2, IEC 62682. They're recognized. This is the proper way of doing things. Although compliance is voluntary, I think you should follow that. It's in your interest to do that. Because if anything goes wrong, you can say, well, I've done what I had to do. I've done the best I can. I've followed everything that I should do. Okay, well, it's not quite as bad as, no, I didn't do anything, or I made up my own rules because it was easier. So I think people should comply with the standards, although it's not mandatory. So closing thoughts with our virus. I believe you should try and comply with the standards. Can we delay the work for compliance? Well, no. If a piece of legislation, for example, the COMA regs, say you have to do alarm management, do you need to comply with the standard? You don't have to, unless you're subject to regulatory intervention. And as in the letter I showed you earlier, or excerpts I showed, it references the international alarm management standards. So unless you've got that, you don't have to do the work. So you could delay it and prioritize it if you have no external pressures or issues. But if you do have an improvement notice from a regulator, or you have to manage your alarms for any other reason, legislatively speaking, then you can't put it off. You have to do it. And obviously, if you remember in the letter earlier, the company were given specific dates when they had to complete things by. Excuse me. I don't think there would be any excuse to say we couldn't write our alarm philosophy by January next year because of the virus. Companies around the world have set up IT infrastructure to allow people to work from home. You could write a philosophy at home. There's nothing to stop you. There's nothing to stop you using a web browser to dial into your alarm management software to review the alarm rates. You could see there was an issue with alarm rates. You could email the maintenance staff that are on site, that are there, part of your essential personnel, to deal with the issue. So there's no real reason why the virus would stop you from having to do things. So unless you've got any external issues, you don't have to. You can put things back, but think carefully about whether you do that or not. So hopefully that hasn't muddied the waters too much. Do you have to comply with standards? No, unless. And do you have to comply with the whole standard? Well, yes, but no. So just think, my opinion is you should comply with the standards. It's in your best interests. Well, I don't have anything else to say unless we have any questions, which hopefully James has been monitoring. Details of how to contact us are on the screen at the moment. I'm on the left-hand side and all our information is on the screen. I shall hand over to James to see if anyone has any questions, please.
Thanks, Ian. Some useful information there. As Ian said, we're going to open up the session for a few questions. If anybody has any, then either raise your hand and we'll unmute you, or you can key them into the interface and we'll answer them from there. So we'll just take a moment for any questions.
Clearly, if anyone does have any questions, then we can help you with how you should go about compliance.
Yep, indeed. Thank you, Ian. So as there are no questions, it just remains to close out this webinar then. So I'd just like to say thank you all for attending. We'll be in touch with details of our next webinar soon. And in the meantime, we'll get this one uploaded to YouTube so you can view it there. If you have any further questions or wish to get in touch regarding improving your alarm systems, then please do get in touch. Thank you and goodbye.